This is the Sri Ramana Maharshi Satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and deeply meditate. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. And welcome. I'm Richard Clarke, hosting this satsang. I am one who loves this teaching, so I want to share it. Sharing it with you helps me better understand Ramana's words. So thank you for your help. And I'm reviewing and commenting on the book Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. And this week we will have a talk from talks 95 and 96. Let me get on to them. And this is talk 95. The same gentleman, Mr. Grant Duff, asked the master about the material relation between memory and will and their relation to the mind. Maharshi said they are functions of the mind. Okay. In answering Grant Duff, Ramana Maharshi says the mind, memory, and will are all functions of the ego. The ego, which has no independent existence, borrows, so to say, its knowing capacity from the consciousness, from the awareness that is the true self. The ego or individual self is an illusory entity that arises from ignorance and its ignorance of the true nature of the self. The ego is a construct that arises in consciousness and acts as an intermediary between what seems like an individual self and an apparently objective world. The mind, memory, and will are all functions of the ego. They're necessary for the ego to carry out its assumed role as the I that experiences the world and identifies with the body and thoughts that arise in the mind. When we say I, we point to our body. The mind is constantly creating and interpreting experiences. It interprets them based on the ego idea, the idea that I am an individual set off against and functioning in an external world. The ego and everything else in relation to these experiences. Memory helps the ego maintain a sense of continuity and identity and make decisions based on past experiences. Memory, though, can also be a source of suffering if it's used to cling to past experiences instead of being in the present moment. Memory can also be a source of fear, leading to aversion of the present moment. In either case, you're not being in the present moment. Will is the power of the ego to direct the mind towards a particular outcome. The will allows the ego to act as agent in the world, to make choices and to direct attention towards its desires and aspirations. Will can also be a source of suffering when it's focused on the ego's desires and objectives and is not aligned with your higher self. Advaita Vedanta teaches that the ego and the mind are not ultimate reality, but rather are relative and dependent on the true self for their existence. The ultimate reality is non-dual consciousness, consciousness that knows itself beyond time, space, and causation, which permeates the mind, and consciousness is the source of all experiences. The goal of Advaita Vedanta is the realization of the ultimate reality of the self as the self, transcending ego and mind. This is done using self-inquiry as a tool, reflecting on the nature of the self and questioning the ego's beliefs and assumptions about reality. Through self-inquiry, the ego can be seen to be unreal, then dissolve, and then realization comes. Knowing the ultimate reality of the self, you know it because you are it. Knowing and being are one. Knowing the self as the self by the self. Self-knowing consciousness. Ramana Maharshi tells us that the mind, memory, and will are all functions of the ego. However, ultimate reality is non-dual consciousness, and Advaita Vedanta is the transcending of the ego and the mind and the realization of the ultimate reality of the self. Through the practice of self-inquiry, you can dissolve the mind and realize the ultimate reality of the self. Now to verse 86, or talk 86 rather. And here this is a little different for Ramana. The master gave the true significance of the Christian faith. Thus, Christ is the ego.
Wow.
The cross is the body. When the ego is crucified and it perishes, what survives is the absolute being, God. Compare this with the statement from the Bible, I and my Father are one. And this glorious survival is called resurrection. So how about that? Now, this statement is a beautiful interpretation of the Christian faith from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta. According to Advaita, the ultimate reality is the absolute and unchanging consciousness, often referred to as Brahman. The individual ego, or the I consciousness, is seen as an illusion, which obscures the true nature of reality. In Ramana's interpretation, Christ represents the ego, and the cross represents the body. The crucifixion of the ego refers to the process of surrendering the individual identity and then realizing the true nature of the self as the unchanging consciousness. The so-called ego perishes when it is realized as an illusion, and the individual is dissolved into the absolute reality represented by God by the Christians. I and my Father are one, was said by Jesus in the book of John. It is an expression of the non-dual nature of reality. It speaks to the ultimate reality that the individual self and the absolute reality are not separate, not two things, but are one and the same. Not two, but one thing, non-dual. Here, Jesus is in alignment with Advaita Vedanta, and this is the highest state of consciousness where the illusion of duality is completely transcended. Ramana's interpretation of the Christian faith provides a unique and profound perspective of the nature of reality and the path to realizing one's true nature as the unchanging consciousness. I think it also points to a deeper synchronicity between the teachings of Jesus and Ramana Maharshi. Now we will listen to my teacher with a discourse, The Mind. Let me cue it up.
The mind resolves itself in the self. The mind is dissolved. The mind is destroyed. These statements and one similar to them we find in the instructions given by the Maharshi, as well as strewn throughout the Upanishads and other scriptures. What is the mind? On the one hand, the Maharshi has said the mind is only a bundle of thoughts. And on the other hand, the Maharshi has said the mind simply does not exist. Regarding the latter instruction, he has said realizing the mind's non-existence is the direct path for all. What is the mind? When he said it is only a bundle of thoughts, it's to remove the false notion that there is a second knowing entity other than the infinite consciousness. The infinite consciousness in which there is no knower and known, no subject and object, which are illusions that appear only in the waking state of mind and the dreaming state of mind. When he said, this is the direct path for all, to realize the mind's non-existence. What else is this but the profound realization that there is no second identity, no second entity, and therefore no duality? That is, there is no one to say, I know the self, or I do not know the self. regarded as a bundle of thoughts, the first thought, integrally connected to all the other thoughts, is the notion I. It is merely the barest assumption, hardly a thought. All the other ideas are based upon it. Or from another perspective, all the other ideas are just the idea of I in various guises. Therefore, the inquiry, who am I, puts an end to the mind by showing that it never actually exists. That which was never created is said to perish or dissolve. What else is that resolution, dissolution, or destruction but the knowledge of what is real, in which the unreal has never come to be? What else is loss of the ego but the realization that the self alone exists eternally? And there is nothing and no one else, ever. The reality that alone is, for which there is no alternative, for which there is no other, in which there is no differentiation, which is beginningless and endless, is truly called non-duality. Whether you comprehend what is being indicated or not, even now, what is it that so knows? I understand, I do not understand. What is it that knows this? To fathom the depths of your own identity, your own existence, you must inquire more deeply than the perceiving and the conceiving, the perceived and the conceived. For what you are in truth certainly cannot be a body or the senses. And it cannot be the mind or its thought forms. What is it that you call I? What is it that appears as a mind? Existence, which is invariably singular, which alone deserves the name I, what is its nature? The consciousness which is ever shining, synonymous with that existence, which always knows, but is never divided into triads of knower, knowing, and known. What is it? Can there be a mind in that? If all of illusion and its consequent bondage and suffering is just the delusion of the mind, yet the mind itself is found not to exist, what remains? Inquire within yourself to know the knower without superimposing any of the attributes of the known upon the knower. Self-luminous consciousness, self-known, hence self-knowledge, remains. You who are, however you imagine yourself to be, inquire as to who you are. Being, which is unborn and indestructible, utterly formless and undifferentiated, which always is only as it is, remains as it always is. This we loosely refer to as self-realization. Yet who realizes what? Nevertheless, the falsely assumed ego or mind is nowhere to be found. Bondage is impossible, and immortal bliss is realized as the natural state.
All right, we're going to take a little time now and inquire to make what we have heard our own immediate experience. Quiet yourself and take a long breath in. Feel your breath. A long exhale. And notice that you exist, and you know that you exist. You don't need your senses or your mind to know this. You just know. You know it directly. Now, inquire, investigate within yourself. What is the mind? Ramana said it's a bundle of thoughts. Is any of those thoughts you? Is some collection of those thoughts you? Do you know the mind? Who knows the mind? If you know a thought as this, then that thought is objective to you. You are the knower. Do you know memories? What are memories anyway? Does the self have memory? Or is memory from the body and mind? Do you know your will, this sense of agency? What is will? Where does it come from? Whose will is it? If you look deeply, you see the will is from the body and mind. Does the self have a will? Ramana Maharshi said many times, I have no sankalpas. Sankalpa is a Sanskrit word for will. Does the self have a will? Who am I? What is the nature of my existence? All right. Let us close with a short chant. Om. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. All right, questions or comments? I see something's coming from there, Doug.
Well, Ramana bringing up Christianity. I read this weekly newsletter, a Catholic weekly newsletter, comes from Spain. I've been getting it for many years, actually, when I used to be a Catholic. And one of the columnists in this newsletter calls himself Fray Marcos. And there's so much similarity between what he says and what Ramana says. If you just change the vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this newsletter is sort of a maverick Catholic newsletter. It's called Adult Faith.
Mm-hmm.
The implication being the Catholic dogma is really not for adults. It's somewhat childish, and which is true. And so it just says the similarities has the last month or so when it's just a week, but I read Fray Marcos and he and Ramana have a lot in common.
Mm-hmm. So I would say you're getting a fairly deep view of Christianity there. And, to me, one of the things that points to the similarity is Jesus's statement that the kingdom of heaven is within.
Yeah.
It points the same way. And of course, it looks to me like Mary Magdalene, who was a primary promoter of the deeper teachings of Jesus, was thrown out of Christianity by the men who didn't want to change what they were doing to actually follow what Jesus taught.
Yeah.
And what we got is the leftovers. And, one of the things I think about Christianity, and we see it with other spiritual teachers, is we had some great teacher who attracted these people who wanted to hear and to follow his wisdom. And the people who stuck around, some people just got it. And when they got it, they would leave and go do whatever they were called to do. Some people didn't get it, and they were around with the teacher. And then when the teacher died, the ones that were around him who didn't get it are the ones who get to be the leaders.
Right. And they're the ones who changed him into a religion.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And certainly, Christianity is not the only place where we see this. There are lots of other people in India, particularly, but in the West also, who had great depth, and attracted people. And the people who followed him just ran it in the ground because they didn't have it. Jesus taught only for 2 years. I was at satsang with Nomi for 15 years, and maybe I'm slow, but I think that long is how long it takes to get started. And so, very few people could be with one of these high teachers for such a short time and actually get it. And maybe Mary Magdalene did. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting interpretation of Christianity from Ramana's viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was just using the symbols.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, all right. It was another good session. It's, very good that we're able to be together. And namaste. And
Namaste.
see you next week. And
Namaste.
keep inquiring.
Thank you, Richard.